and welcome to Just Plain Wrong, the podcast where three Mennonite librarians discuss depictions of Amish, Mennonites, and other plain groups in popular culture. I'm Erin, here with my co-hosts Abby and Tilly to discuss some Amish episodes of two sitcoms, Schitt's Creek and Third Rock from the Sun, not to be confused, as Abby may or may not have, with 30 Rock. So to start off this week, I thought we'd just chat a little about sitcoms. These are both 30-minute comedies. One has a live studio audience, the other doesn't. But is this something you watch? Do you watch a lot of comedies? What are your favorites? Any you'd recommend?
Every time I get asked for TV recommendations, I just say Parks and Recreation. And I've been saying this for years. I like other Michael Schur developed shows, Brooklyn Nine-Nine, The Good Place, a lot as well. But when I want comfort or I have to, clean the house but I need something on, I'll put on Parks and Rec. And it only becomes more true with time. The longer that I live in Indiana, the more accurate it seems. And the longer I know people who work in public service, the more accurate it seems. And it's just beautiful. Every part of it is beautiful.
I very much agree. I Parks and Rec is also on my favorite list. I will say, and this might be slightly controversial, that when I rewatch, I skip most of season 1 and just start watching when Chris and Ben arrive. Because I feel like that's when the magic happens. Another one I would recommend is Better Off Ted. I think it only has maybe 2 or 3 seasons. It got cut short before its time. It's hilarious. It's very much a stand-up of corporate culture and also science and how things are invented. It has some really scathing things to say about that, while also having a nice warm sense of family and you end up rooting for the characters, which is often what I'm looking for in a comedy. I feel like a lot of times drama these days are all about characters that you really kind of hate. And to me, I still like rooting for the people involved. And then the only other one I would recommend, and this is not, it's kind of a comedy, it's kind of a drama, but it's not 30 minutes and it's not a sitcom, is, of course, the wonderful classic Firefly, another show all too short. I think it only got half a season, but it did get a movie, and I love that show. So it's also on the cycle of rewatches.
I don't know that I knew that Tilly was also a big Parks and Rec fan. I don't know that I knew that about you, Abby. It is also it's my favorite show, maybe of all time. I've probably seen every episode, I'd say at least 4 times, maybe more. It's like my comfort food. I just keep going back to it. And I love when I finish watching it and Netflix is trying to recommend other shows. I'm like, oh no, you don't understand. I'm just going to watch it again. I am also a pretty big fan of Schitt's Creek. And I do think one thing those two shows have in common is that season 1 is something you sort of have to endure because it's important background information. But for both seasons, they're not really, I didn't think, that good until season 2. I have a lot of friends who haven't gotten into Schitt's Creek, and I'm like, just power through. Midway through season 2, it becomes amazing and you won't want to stop watching it. Like Abby, I feel compelled to throw in a third one that doesn't really fit the question. And that is my current obsession, which is a British game show called Taskmaster, which you can find, I think the first 7 or 8 seasons are on YouTube. And it's just very absurd and perfect for, a COVID terrible time when you just want to relax and watch British comedians do ridiculous things like paint a horse while riding a horse, or meet a stranger and then have to write a song about her an hour later. It's very fun, and I'm very grateful to the people who recommended it and got me starting to watch it. TV recommendations from your friends at Plain Wrong Pod. If you also like Parks and Rec, then welcome to our little pod.
Our cult.
I feel like everyone who likes Parks and Rec really likes Parks and Rec, and then everyone else just either hasn't tried it or gives up in season 2.
Well, we're going to start this week by talking about Schitt's Creek. So if you're unfamiliar with the show, the premise is a wealthy family that has lost everything, forcing them to move to the one thing they have left. They own the town of Schitt's Creek. Our Amish episode takes place at the beginning of season 2 when the Rose family is still mostly terrible and David has run away from home. And the family sort of looks for him, though Alexa is in the midst of boy problems with Ted and Mutt, and Moira is far more concerned about her missing bag that David has stolen. Turns out he was using it for toiletries. Eventually, they locate David on an Amish farm, and the Amish family is very excited to see David leave, saying that his presence has taught them, quote, valuable lessons in patience, forgiveness, and restraint. And the way that the Amish woman character delivers the word restraint is just amazing, I think. So there isn't a ton of content in this episode that's pertinent to the Amish, so we don't have a ton to discuss, but general thoughts on how the Amish are depicted in these scenes? And Abby, will start with you.
Yeah, the Amish scene in this episode was not super long, but it does play pretty heavily into the trope of Amish as retreat from the world, a place to escape, to hide. And again, there is very little reason or explanation given as to why this Amish family would decide, why, yes, let's take this strangely dressed young man in and let him stay with us. Did he come knocking at their door and they just felt obliged to let him stay? Did he make up some story about being a missing cousin, a la For Richer or Poorer? I think this idea that the Amish are places to hide or get away from the world is clearly one invented by the outsiders, the English. While it does portray the Amish in a positive light, it really reinforces the idea that they only exist to be a response to the English. But I would really have interest in hearing how this trope is perceived among the Amish themselves. Like, do they appreciate being seen as the retreat or place to hide or place to escape to for in most of their portrayals?
Yeah, that's a good point. Because I think we think, oh, it's a getaway. You just, detox from phones and social media, but it's not like the Amish lifestyle is easy. So why people romanticize it, I'm never quite sure, but it's something compelling for sure, because the whole reason this podcast can exist is because people romanticize the Amish way of life. Which brings me to my major concern about this episode, which is that when we first see David, when the rest of the Rose family pulls up to this Amish farm, David is crouching in a hayfield, holding a hay rake, while an Amish woman just sort of stabs at the ground with a hoe. And David is not doing anything. And the Amish woman, I would argue, is not doing anything. That you don't need to hoe a hayfield. So I don't think she's doing anything remotely plausible there. But I think it's also sort of in keeping with Schitt's Creek, which is a show about a lot of people who are inept in almost every area of their lives. You get a few people who know how to do a couple of things like really well. But mostly there's just a lot of flailing around, and the main characters are the kind of people who would just stand in a field with a hay rake and not really worry about being productive. So it makes sense that in this entire town of just oddballs, that even the nearby Amish family would probably also be a little odd. So I'm willing to forgive, I think Miriam is her name, her strangeness in hoeing a hayfield. I will say, and I don't know what you guys thought of this, Miriam's character was churning butter at one point. And I don't know if this is just because I've seen a lot of Amish people in line at Aldi, which is where I get most of my groceries. Just stacks of butter. Lots and lots of butter gets purchased. I just feel like even the Amish know that churning butter is a waste of time. Erin, you actually lived with an Amish family for a while. Is churning butter still a thing?
Right. A while being 1 week in high school.
Well, yeah.
And I don't actually remember, and I think I would remember if someone was churning butter, like literally. So I'm gonna agree with you and say no, it was from the store.
I think it's a Pioneer thing and not an Amish thing. There's some overlap between Amish people and Laura Ingalls Wilder, but that is not part of it.
I mean, I don't doubt that some Amish do have butter churns and maybe still use them, but yeah. It sort of goes back to like the plowing points you made in For Richer or Poor. Like even the Amish recognize efficiency.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's just not worth their time. They'll sell the milk or use the milk and cream, but if they're going to the store, they can buy butter like the rest of us.
Well, since you brought it up, I guess I could talk a little more about my David-esque experience of living with the Amish under much less dramatic circumstances. The high school I went to was a small private high school, and as part of that, we did something called interterm, where I don't know, most people got to sign up and go to cool trips. And my freshman year, I got my last choice, and I ended up living with an Amish family for a week, which now that I'm 38 is a really cool experience. And I'm very glad I did it. But at 14, I was very angry that I didn't get to go to Denver or Chicago or one of the cool places with my friends. Yeah, and it was a really eye-opening experience. I think I was usually up by 5:30 a.m. I didn't have to farm. Thankfully, the family I stayed with was, the dad was a construction worker. So he had a small shop outside, and I think I fed chickens and helped garden, but I didn't have to hoe any hay fields.
I would hope not. That'd just be this futility. Don't try that.
But it is where I learned to do random things like drive a buggy, though I wouldn't trust myself to do that anymore. It's been a while. And I made homemade grape nuts and pasta. And thankfully, the family I stayed with also had indoor plumbing because, yeah, when we talk about romanticizing the Amish, just be thankful if you're going to stay with them if they have indoor plumbing.
Outhouses, not a thing of glamour.
My only other comment on Schitt's Creek before we move on to our other sitcom is they didn't talk about it, but they made all these implications about how extreme David's behavior must have been when he was there. And I really wish we had gotten more of that. And it's very Schitt's Creek-esque to just sort of allude to things and let us imagine. But I really would have loved an entire episode of watching him interact. Anyway.
I do have to just add to that. I did love the line when the dad tries to invite them all, like he sees them setting up for their lunch. He says, "Oh yeah, you generally invite strangers to stay with you for your lunch?" And the Amish father just looks at him and goes, "Not always." Which I think was an excellent use of like Amish throwing shade. I very much appreciated
the
that.
biggest turkey, like it was massive.
I know. Just a typical Amish lunch, just
Thanksgiving every day.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, moving on, our second episode this week is from the late 90s sitcom Third Rock from the Sun. I find this sitcom just generally a bit over the top and very hammy, for lack of a better word. And it's about a family of aliens that live undercover as humans in central Ohio. And the episode starts with them watching an awards show for the Alien Proby Awards, and they lose out on the best mission in a single solar system category to another family living in Central Ohio. So Harry and Sally are sent out to find these other aliens and figure out their secrets to success and how they won this award. So they're on the lookout for, quote, someone who looks a little off, and soon after they see some old order Amish and mistakenly assume that they are aliens. Harry and Sally decide to live with them temporarily to learn all of their secrets, and then they are kicked out for corrupting the Amish couple's daughter. So a bit more to go on here, but general thoughts on the depictions here. Tilly, we'll start with you.
As per usual with this show, made me laugh because of the inaccuracies as well as because of the attempt of humor. So it was a bit of a blast from the past to watch Third Rock from the Sun. I forgot it was set in Ohio, which normally as a Buckeye native, I would say that I have a pretty good grounding in everything that's set in Ohio because I'm obliged to feel pride about it. The big standouts to me were the accents that they gave the Amish characters were just really weird. Like they weren't even German. They definitely weren't Dutchy. They weren't anything really. Like I couldn't pinpoint. I feel like they just took the actors and were like, sound different.
I think it was something like, we were Amish.
Yeah, like I don't know what that is. Like it was like a little bit of Minnesota thrown into like some German, and they shook it up and it just came out wrong. So the accents were terrible. Most of the things that I noticed is just this tendency that we saw in things like Schitt's Creek to assume that the Amish are basically Puritans. So, like, the daughter was named Prudence, and a lot of the behavior, and she was also churning butter, you know, and and the mother character, whose name I don't remember, was carrying around like milk pails with a yoke across her shoulders, and I was like, I'm pretty sure that this none of this makes sense. It's you're confusing like the olden days with the now, and Puritans not at all linked to Anabaptists. So yeah, Prudence didn't work for me. Also, they pulled the whole like, oh well, you're here and it's time for harvesting, so I guess we can feed and house you for a week thing. And again, just you would not hire Englishers, non-Amish people,
Or aliens, literally.
or definitely
Yeah.
not aliens, to help with farmers. You wouldn't.
Aaron, apparently you can correct me if I'm wrong. If you live with the Amish, do they dress you in Amish clothes or do you just wear your own clothes?
Interesting question. And at least the Amish I stayed with, it was we could wear what we wanted, but we were encouraged because we were there as a school group to like, you know, be respectful, however we interpreted that. So I believe I tried to wear skirts at least, but no, they did not give me their children's Amish gear to wear around.
Yeah. So I have a cousin who was when she was young, her babysitters, her daycare people were old order Mennonite, and she would change into old order clothing. They dropped her off. So wow. I guess there's some precedent for, you know, like if you're here, you adopt our clothing.
Well, and Harry and Sally did say they wanted to learn all their ways, so maybe that was included in that.
What was that line? I did like Harry's line, something about how confusing he never really did figure out zippers or something. So at least he was excited about the buttons.
Yep.
I did like that. Yeah, and I do want to just add when Tilly was talking about the woman wearing a yoke with her carrying milk pails. This was not like in doing chores or anything too. This was like while going to the general store, which again, I shop at Aldi's, which means I have seen many Amish shop, and they do not bring wooden pails to pick up their groceries and then carry them around on a wooden yoke. So, don't
they
know where that was
tote bags
from.
like everybody else.
Exactly.
I'd maybe add a couple things. One is there was actually this really interesting dynamic. So because the aliens didn't know that the Amish weren't aliens, they kept saying things like assuming they were aliens. And one of those was, well, you guys could do a better job trying to fit in. And the Amish characters are like, but we don't want to fit in. And they tried to explain it. And then Harry and Sally take that to mean that they should be doing a less better job blending in. So like it was this surprisingly kind of accurate thing. Like, well, yeah, the Amish aren't trying to fit in, even though they didn't get the why. There was also a prayer scene that I kind of loved. The Amish family says a prayer before the meal and they do the like praying hands motion. And I haven't watched enough Third Rock from the Sun to really understand the whole joke, but apparently each alien has its own like hand signal. So the alien characters assume that this is like the Amish alien team's hand signal and they start doing their own hand signal. And I didn't really get it, but I found it very funny. This episode gives us one of our first of a very common trope, and that is where a random mean Englisher tries to fight an Amish person. So Harry, dressed as an Amish man, is in the hardware store, and these two guys straight out of like 1998 ask if he wants ice cream, and then they shove the ice cream cone in his face. And this is a very common trope I've found in movies and even books about Amish. And I'm assuming it connects back to Witness, where Harrison Ford's character punches some mean tourist. But thoughts on this scene and thoughts on why this is a trope that we keep seeing?
So this scene reminds me a little bit of the what if someone attacked your grandma kind of question that pacifists get asked sometimes. And for reference, Joan Baez has an excellent essay response to that as to when you take something and kind of play it out to its full end. Basically, instead of dealing with the complexities of what it is like to be nonviolent or non-resistant, the writers just want a quick way to demonstrate that Amish don't fight. That said, I don't entirely blame them for going this particular route. This is a 30-minute show after all, or more accurately, a 22-minute show after commercial breaks, which it's funny, remember commercial breaks back in the day? So yeah, I think a lot of it is just, it's trying to play off of a shorthand that we have in our idea of how things work, which obviously when you shorten things, you oversimplify them, which is what happens here.
Yeah, I went down a different train of thought about the depiction of pacifists in any mainstream media. And I guess that having Amish people being the victims of bullying is a way to show them as underdogs. It's a way to convey that someone is a pacifist and make it kind of noble, which is interesting to me because I feel like mainstream culture is very choosy about what kinds of pacifism are noble. So if you're resisting bullying, if your suffering is, personal or the result of bullying or being mocked, then it's noble for you to do it. But if your pacifist action actually goes against the grain, say you're an anti-war protester, then the response is different. Then you get the you just don't care about people and you're shut off from the world and you profit from our violence without being violent yourselves and you're a hypocrite. And there are interesting arguments there that we could unpack, but people don't seem to realize that the pacifism that prevents an Amish person from shoving away a bully is the same pacifism that prevents them from participating in war. And they treat it so differently depending on how it's framed. And, it occurred to me that I don't feel like I've actually ever seen real life instances of that sort of day-to-day bullying of Amish or other plain groups. I've heard of plenty of horror stories about pacifists being mocked and abused in larger systemic ways, like when in World War I, fighting for the right to be conscientious objectors. I heard stories about my grandparents' church getting defaced with buckets of yellow paint because they were considered cowards. I hear about those things, but I've never heard about any of my ancestors going to town and getting beaten up randomly. So it's, I don't know, it perplexes me.
Thank you, Tilly. I think that really lays out some of the more complex pieces of how the Amish are and the conscientious objector and pacifist pieces and how that's perceived. I did think that this was a 22-minute sitcom, but I actually thought the way this little scene played out was rather fascinating. So Harry is played by, I think, a rather over-the-top actor, and he's, I think, supposed to be kind of dumb. Anyway, so these two Amish, or these two bullies, try and shove this ice cream in his face, but Harry doesn't actually realize he's being picked on. He thinks they're legitimately trying to give him ice cream and just keep missing. And so every time they shove the ice cream in his face, he's like, "We'll get it next time." I don't know if that works in the face of real bullying, but I found his sort of just very optimistic take on the whole situation amusing and a little endearing. So we also see another common trope here, and that is the outsiders corrupting the chaste Amish daughter trope. So David in Schitt's Creek apparently did not corrupt the Amish daughters, though, again, I would have loved to have seen more of how those interactions went. But here we have, again, Harry, our sort of similarly over-the-top character, successfully corrupting the Amish daughter. And it culminates at the end in her revealing a handmade, brand new quilt with Charlie Sheen's face on it. So thoughts on this appearing in this episode?
I did think that the quilt used too many pattern fabrics. Which, if we're talking about realism here, but the applique was nicely done on Charlie Sheen's face.
How did she? So this is 1998, maybe like 2000, if we're at the end of the series, I think. How on earth, like, did he just tell her about Charlie Sheen? And she's like, how did they? This is before smartphones. Anyway, just as a practical matter, I'm not sure how she ever learned what Charlie Sheen looked like.
Yeah, or why she decided on Charlie Sheen. In my memory of this episode, before I rewatched it, I thought that it was Joseph Gordon-Levitt's face because he's a character on the show. And for some reason in my head, I had that she had fallen in love with him and made him a quilt with his face. But that is not, in fact, what happened. It's even weirder than that. It's just randomly Charlie Sheen.
All right, so our last question. To tie this all together, we clumped this episode of Schitt's Creek and this episode of Third Rock from the Sun into the same episode because they both involve situations where we have a non-Amish character ending up living with the Amish. In Third Rock, we have literal aliens, while in Schitt's Creek, we have David, who is arguably a bit like an alien in that he is new to Schitt's Creek and doesn't really fit into his rural Canadian town. So let's chat a little about how that theme was handled. So Tilly, do you want to start?
I thought that as a whole, both TV series handled things fairly well. I think there was definitely the sense that the main characters who were the ones visiting the Amish were not necessarily in the wrong, but that they needed some self-reflection. That it was very clear that we were not supposed to respect David for terrorizing these Amish people, or that we were not supposed to respect Harry and Sally. We were not supposed to respect literal aliens for, their sort of failure to understand the Amish way. That it was pretty clear that if there's a party here that's in the right, it's the Amish, and that they have the right to ask their guests to leave, which in both cases happens. The family that David finds in Schitt's Creek is like, it's time to go now. This is not something that can continue. And in Third Rock from the Sun, the family says, like, you need to go. And they don't necessarily say, like, we regret having you here, but they do say, like, this just isn't right for us, and it's probably not right for you, and you need to move on. And of course, they do this in, 22 minutes with more humor than understanding. But like I think the framework is actually pretty decent.
I mean, I think I would very much agree with that. It was designed, I mean, both of these are designed as outsider perspectives in on the Amish without a lot of, time or attention paid for accuracy. I did think it was kind of amusing because David was, I think, by far the more disrespectful guest. Despite the list of issues, I think the fact that, as two aliens, Harry and Sally would potentially make more mistakes when in how they interacted would make a lot more sense, whereas David is just kind of a horrible person. So yeah, I did think that was kind of interesting in terms of the way it was played. But I did like it, in the end, despite whatever lack of explanation for why they ended up there or any rationale as to why they would invite them in, at least the Amish were able to eventually create some good boundaries around their homes and their lives and tell these odd interlopers to leave.
I agree. I mean, I think this is a common, because it creates such good tension. I think this is something we see a lot in TV shows. You have the sort of extreme character going and getting stuck in a contrasting situation. And I think here it played out. I think both episodes were pretty entertaining. I enjoyed the Third Rock episode far more than I expected to, because it's not a show I thought I would enjoy. Yeah, like you both said, I think the Amish were treated as sort of the, sane ones in this, in these scenarios, sort of keeping it together while they were being interloped upon. Is interloped a word?
Sure.
All right. I'm not quite sure how to handle the rating, so we'll just sort of figure this out as we go. Our rating scale is going to be unnecessary hay forks. But I think rather than like talking about each, maybe just choose one, say which one you enjoyed the most. And I don't know that we have enough to really talk about accuracy either, but
These are both quite enjoyable. I think I am gonna go ahead and just give them a combined. You know what? We've had a couple episodes in. I'm gonna give a 5 out of 5. They were also short, and I got both accomplished in an hour. And that's even almost including watching an entire episode of 30 Rock being very puzzled the entire time. So, they were efficient. But I think I did really enjoy. If I had to pick one that I liked the best, it would be Third Rock, in large part because I think what you pointed out, Aaron, I really did like that kind of brief glimpse at this idea of the Amish getting to talk a little bit about how they, live in the world, but not of the world. Obviously, they didn't use that language, but this idea of not, their goal isn't to fit in. And I thought that was a neat conversation to have in this type of avenue. So yeah, I'm going to give it 5 out of 5 unnecessary hay forks.
I think I would also maybe 4 out of 5 unnecessary hay forks. I think I enjoyed both of them just sort of for the attitude that came from the Amish characters who were just sort of, the Amish characters were sort of understandably exasperated. I think probably Third Rock from the Sun was the one I enjoyed more just because we spent more time in the Amish setting than we did for the Schitt's Creek episode, which was very concerned with a host of other things. Plus, I liked the random John Cleese appearance that happened at the end, and there's like a whole side plot with like a Ren Fair and love letters and John Lithgow, and I was entertained.
I feel like this is a major upset that we are giving this to Third Rock from the Sun because I think
Schitt's Creek is definitely the better show.
Yes, it's definitely the better series if you're choosing between the two. But when it came to like Amish episodes, Third Rock's just it was actually a whole plot versus Schitt's Creek was really just one, maybe 2 scenes. So yeah, I agree. I'm going to give it to Third Rock, and I'm going to go. Maybe I'll shoot the gap. 4.5 unnecessary hay forks. That wraps up this week's discussion on the Amish episodes of Schitt's Creek and Third Rock from the Sun. We'd love to hear your thoughts, and we'd also love your recommendations for what other TV shows might have Amish episodes that we should review. You can email us at plainwrongpod@gmail.com, and you can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at the handle plainwrongpod. So thanks again for listening. We'd appreciate if you would review and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts.